Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I hope you had a chance to have some food and mingle with one another, catch up, spend some time with one another. It's great to have you here. My name is Han-Sol Gu. I'm a faculty member here at School of Theology. Am I saying that right? It's been a long day. And the director of the Godfrey Diekmann Center. Founded in the honor of Father Godfrey Diekmann, who was a monk and teacher here, beloved teacher here at St. John's. The Godfrey Diekmann Center for Liturgy serves the ongoing renewal of the church by promoting scholarly work on the academic and practical dimensions of the liturgy. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for you tonight. She's a great friend of mine and wonderful colleague. Sarah Kathleen Johnson is Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Pastoral Theology at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Ontario. Her research at the intersection of liturgical studies and sociology of religion employs qualitative methods that value everyday religious experience. Commitments to interrogating the relationship between liturgy and ethics and engaging ecumenically across Christian traditions ground her research, teaching, and leadership. Her publications include Occasional Religious Practice. May I show the book? Here it is. Published by the Oxford University Press in 2025. The co-edited volume of Worship and Power, Liturgical Authority in Free Church Traditions. And articles in journals such as Worship, Studia Liturgica, Question liturgique, and Liturgy. Sarah was also the worship resources editor for the Mennonite hymnal and worship book, Voices Together. Sarah holds a Ph.D. in theology from the University of Notre Dame. She is ordained for ministry in the Mennonite Church, Canada, and is an honorary canon in the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. She is currently a resident scholar at the Collegeville Institute. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Kathleen Johnson.
It is an honor to be here today, to deliver the Godfrey Diekmann Lecture and to support the Obsculta Preaching Initiative. My remarks draw in part on my book, Occasional Religious Practice, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience, that came out less than a year ago with Oxford University Press. The book is available through the library here, and you could also purchase a copy using this 30% off discount code. I'm currently about halfway through a 4-month residency at the Collegeville Institute. One of the projects that I am working on is a book about ministry with occasional religious practitioners. The book is still in process. It does not yet have a title. Suggestions are welcome. And I look forward to how this evening may contribute to the development of this book. So please do feel free to follow up, to speak with me at Convivium, to reach out by email, to find a time to talk more about this. It's Christmas Eve. I arrive at the Cathedral Church of St. James, the Anglican Cathedral in downtown Toronto, 15 minutes before the 7:30 p.m. Christmas Eve choral Eucharist is scheduled to begin. The soaring neo-Gothic space already feels full, including overflow chairs on either side of the central box pews. It is a striking contrast to any of the 4 services celebrated at the cathedral each Sunday. I am not the only one aware of the difference. The Archbishop of Toronto ascends to the high pulpit and begins his homily with an expansive welcome. He welcomes those who are, quote, faithful and doubting, those who are, quote, here by choice or by coercion. There is a place for you, he says, although there may not have been a place at the 4:30, suggesting the earlier service was even more crowded. The following year, I attend the 4:30 Christmas Eve lessons and carols at the cathedral. Many seats are filled when I arrive, 45 minutes before the service begins. I slide past an older couple and settle into a pew 5 rows from the back. The pew fills quickly. An elementary school-age child ends up sitting on the lap of a parent at one end. The family had to split up to find seats. By 4:15, every seat is filled, and worshipers line the walls and the back. I returned to the cathedral later that week on the Sunday after Christmas. The chancel is still adorned with gold paraments and an abundance of red poinsettias. Many of the same familiar Christmas carols are included in the liturgy. However, in a stark juxtaposition to 4 days earlier, there are 6 empty pews in front of me, 6 empty pews behind me, and only a couple of people in the same section across the center aisle. The contrast is striking. Although these liturgies took place at the cathedral, participant observation, interviews with clergy, diocesan statistics, and common knowledge suggest they represent patterns in many Anglican parishes in Toronto. Quantitative data indicates patterns are widespread in Canada, the United States, and Europe. How can preachers approach proclaiming the word of God in the liturgy on such occasions? A couple of weeks ago, at the School of Theology Convivium, Father William Skidlarek reflected on his work developing Fulfilled in Your Hearing, the 1982 United States Conference of Catholic Bishops document on preaching. As Father William described, the document looks at 3 major elements of liturgical preaching: the preacher, scripture, and the gathered community. It begins with the gathered community, with the assembly. It provides 2 rationales for taking the assembly as the starting point. First is practical. An accurate understanding of audience is crucial for any effective communication. The second is theological. The gathered community is the church, the body of Christ. Christ is present in the assembly, the people of God. This vision of the church can reinforce a persistent yet false assumption that underlies much liturgical theology. The assumption that liturgical participants are formally affiliated, actively practicing, fully believing, morally compliant, and emotionally engaged in the tradition in which they participate. This is simply not the case. They are not. We are not. The pilgrim people of God are not. One of the ways Fulfilled in Your Hearing feels ahead of its time is its acknowledgement of the diversity of the assembly. The Eucharistic assembly that gathers Sunday after Sunday is a rich and complex phenomenon. Even in parishes that are more or less uniform in ethnic, social, or economic background, there is great diversity. Men and women, old and young, the successes and failures, the joyful and the bereaved, the fervent and the half-hearted, the strong and the weak. Such diversity is a constant challenge to the preacher. The diversity of the assembly is even more of a challenge on the occasions when an even more diverse community gathers. How can preachers approach proclaiming the word of God in the liturgy on such occasions? We begin where we always begin. We begin with the assembly. My focus today is better understanding the assembly when it includes many occasional religious practitioners. I believe this is valuable not only for preachers, but also for ministers who encounter occasional practitioners in other contexts, such as sacramental preparation and spiritual care. I will proceed in 3 parts. The first part will focus on understanding occasional religious practice descriptively as a sociological phenomenon. The second part will focus on thinking theologically about occasional religious practice with an emphasis on dialogue. The third part will explore responding pastorally to occasional religious practice, especially in preaching. Occasional religious practice is a way of relating to religion that is defined by participating in religious practices occasionally rather than routinely, usually in connection with certain types of occasions. I introduce and develop the concept of occasional religious practice, drawing on 3 years of ethnographic research in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, which is similar to the Episcopal Church in the United States. Qualitative research included 61 interviews, participant observation of more than 80 liturgies, and archival research. I am very grateful to the clergy and participants who supported this research. It would not be possible without them. As I share examples from this context, I invite you to reflect on what might be similar or different in your own contexts. Occasional religious practice is occasional in 2 senses. First, occasional religious practice is defined in contrast to routine religious practice. There are also those who are more intensive in their practice, and there is the possibility of never participating in religious practices. These are relative categories that are defined contextually and may change over time. Second, certain types of occasions are associated with occasional religious practice: holidays, life transitions, crises, and incidental circumstances. Holidays are important to occasional practitioners. Christmas and Easter are mentioned with remarkable consistency in interviews. Some parishes even shape their communications with holiday occasional practitioners in mind. One parish listed the Holy Week and Easter worship schedule on a newsletter distributed on Christmas Eve. Another actively advertised an upcoming Mother's Day brunch on Easter Sunday. Life transitions are also central to many occasional practitioners, including birth, marriage, and death. This last quote from an interview with a godmother is one of my favorites. "My fiancé has said he does not like going to church, so unless it was a baptism, I probably wouldn't have got him there. Are there other occasions when he would attend?" I ask. "Well, we're getting married next week, so he'll have to go." Times of personal or communal crisis are another occasion for religious practice. Crisis may intersect with life transition. It may also involve natural or human-caused disasters, medical diagnoses or accidents, or more subtle struggles. Finally, incidental circumstances, such as attending evensong as a tourist or providing transportation to an aging parent, may be occasions for religious practice. Participation in corporate worship is the most obvious form of occasional religious practice and is the focus of my research. However, participation in any recognizably religious practice would qualify. The concept of occasional religious practice is anchored in definitions of religion that prioritize practice, such as theories proposed by Martin Riesbrat and Christian Smith. Religion in this context is not about affiliation, belief, or function. It is about observable participation in a meaningful system of concrete, culturally prescribed practices. Occasional practitioners can be considered occasionally religious regardless of their affiliation, their beliefs, their reasons for practicing, or their attitudes and experiences while practicing. And they are extremely diverse in all of these ways. A story. Catherine has a Roman Catholic and Orthodox background, yet has never attended religious services routinely and now identifies as agnostic. Cameron has a Roman Catholic and Anglican background and was raised in the Anglican tradition. When Catherine and Cameron's first child is born, they initially pursue Catholic baptism. However, the parishes Catherine contacts require godparents to participate in baptismal preparation in person, which is not possible for Catherine's brother who lives in China. Catherine next inquires about baptism at a local Anglican parish, and much to my surprise, reports they only baptize older children, which is not an acceptable option for her Orthodox extended family, who are anxious for the child to be baptized as soon as possible, just in case. Catherine and Cameron persist and reach out to a historic Anglican parish at a distance from their home, where Cameron's cousins had their children baptized and where his family has a cemetery plot. They receive a generous welcome and the flexibility they require for Catherine's brother to participate. The baptism of their first child in this parish establishes a pattern they follow for their next two children. Although they attend only on the occasion of the baptisms, Catherine and Cameron appreciate the warmth of the clergy, the liturgical space, and the music, and what they consider to be a positive and celebratory mood. Cameron's mother, who has practiced routinely in both the Roman Catholic and Anglican traditions at different times in her life, is relieved that her grandchildren are baptized at all. Her second husband is Hindu and is happy to be present to support his family on these occasions. Participants in this research describe their religious identities in many different ways. All of them were present at Anglican baptisms and funerals, among other occasions for Christian worship. Now, of course, some participants in Anglican practices do identify as Anglican, and this may be tied to past or present belief or practice, or cultural heritage and family background, or personal choice. Many participants, such as Cameron, claim Anglican identity apart from routine practice. Some participants in Anglican practices affiliate with other expressions of Christianity, such as Roman Catholicism, and understand their religious identities in a similar range of ways. This includes Catherine, who continues to identify as Catholic and Orthodox. Some participants identify simply as Christian. Conservative Protestants may identify as Christian as a theological statement. More often, Christian is either a primary category of identification among racialized Canadians or a default category among white Canadians. Occasional participants in Christian practices may also identify with non-Christian religious traditions. Cameron's mother's Hindu husband is one example. This is sometimes visible in the worship space. At one Anglican baptism service that I observed, a turbaned Sikh was enthusiastically serving as the family photographer. Occasional practitioners also claim a range of non-religious identities. They may identify as spiritual, to indicate a sense of spiritual connection in their lives, or to point to participation in alternative spiritual practices, or simply to suggest they are non-religious but not anti-religious. Some occasional practitioners identify as atheist or agnostic or are indifferent to religion. Catherine identifies as agnostic. Attention to occasional religious practice reveals that this is the eclectic mixture of participants in Christian worship in the Anglican tradition in Toronto. This is the assembly. In a few weeks, you may attend an Easter Sunday liturgy, or perhaps you will be at a wedding or a funeral. Imagine looking around you. Consider who might be there with you. With this tremendous diversity in the room, it is unsurprising that there are diverse motivations for occasional participation. I develop a taxonomy of types of occasional practitioners. These types are associated with situational roles and motivations, not stable identity categories. Occasional practitioners include initiators who bring about the practice. For example, a daughter who plans her mother's funeral, or a grandfather who decides his family is going to church together on Christmas Eve. Catherine initiates her children's baptisms. Initiators may be motivated by cultural heritage, a strong sense of Italian Catholic identity, for instance. They may be motivated by a specific relational connection, to a friend, a family member, or even a clergy person. Some may be motivated by a desire for spiritual connection, space for reflection, or to express gratitude. Initiators may also be invisibly routine, meaning they practice privately but not publicly and therefore appear occasional. An example of this would be praying with children before bed. Very few of the occasional practitioners I interviewed were invisibly routine. In addition, there are those who are involuntarily occasional, meaning they desire to practice routinely, but barriers beyond their control prevent them from doing so, such as depending on others for transportation. Occasional practice is not always a choice. In contrast to initiators, some occasional practitioners are supporters. Advocates encourage occasional practice without being in the position to initiate it. For example, Cameron's mother advocates for the baptism of her grandchildren. Inner circle supporters may have central roles, such as making faith commitments alongside their partner on behalf of their child, or offering a eulogy, despite having little personal investment in the practice. Outer circle supporters tend not to have leadership responsibilities, like a coworker or a second cousin who attend a funeral. Catalysts include the infant being baptized and the deceased. They bring about the practice, but can neither directly initiate nor support it. Occasional practice is shaped by complex motivations and circumstances. These motivations are personal and social, spiritual and cultural, although these dimensions of human experience are often difficult to differentiate. Each type of occasional practice is substantial. None of these types of occasional religious practice can be easily dismissed. These practices are meaningful and purposeful for participants. It is inaccurate and unhelpful to assume that legitimate religious practice consists primarily of individual cognitive assent and routine or intensive participation. Occasional practice, in its diversity, is a significant and very ordinary way of relating to religion. So I invite you to take a couple of minutes now to turn to one or two people seated nearby and to share a story about occasional religious practice. Perhaps you see yourself in some of these categories in certain situations or at certain times in your life. Perhaps this provides language to name people you know, a partner, a parent, a friend. Perhaps you have encountered these types of occasional practitioners in the context of your ministry. So take about 4 minutes to share a story about occasional religious practice with a couple of people nearby. Well, I trust that many of you had stories to share. And if we had all night, I would love to hear all of them. But occasional religious practice is very, very widespread, although it is not a new phenomenon. What I call occasional religious practice is a common thread that runs through the literature on religious change in Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, and Australia. So, for example, based on national survey data, sociologist Reginald Bibby claims 44% of Canadians are, quote, low religious, those in the religious middle who neither embrace nor reject religion. Bibby describes this population primarily in terms of occasional ritual participation. The so-called low religious are the dominant group in every region, age, and gender category in Canada. In the United States, the Pew Research Center introduced a new religious typology in 2017. Instead of categorizing Americans by religious affiliation, it identifies 3 groups: the highly religious, somewhat religious, and non-religious. The Sunday stalwarts, that top group, are the only group characterized by routine practice. Catholic sociologist Maureen Day claims 53% of Catholics in the United States are cultural Catholics, to use her term. They self-identify as Catholic and report attending Mass never or a few times a year, apart from weddings and funerals. In other words, the majority of Catholics in the United States could be considered occasional practitioners. Please note that this does not include people who participate in Catholic practices occasionally who no longer self-identify as Catholic or who identify with other Christian or religious traditions. Day's cultural Catholics are only a subset of occasional participants in Catholic practices. Each of these analyses of the contemporary religious landscape points to a complex religious middle ground. While there are certainly those at the extremes of religion and non-religion, many more people exist somewhere in between. Occasional practice is an important characteristic of this middle ground, although some occasional practitioners are also found at the edges. In this literature, occasional religious practice is usually grouped with other measures and markers of religion, such as affiliation and belief, to create broader categories. My introduction and development of the concept of occasional religious practice as a way of relating to religion in its own right contributes to this conversation in various ways, 3 of which I highlight today with preaching in mind. First, a focus on occasional religious practice, apart from other dimensions of religion, reveals the internal diversity of occasional practitioners. Not all occasional practitioners are culturally religious or vicariously religious or non-religious, but it is likely that some relate to religion in each of these ways. A close look at occasional practice provides a crucial window into the diversity that is present when religious practices, including preaching, are taking place. It illuminates who is part of the assembly. Second, occasional religious practice aspires to be value-neutral terminology. It aims to avoid presenting occasional religious practice as somehow irregular, low, fuzzy, fringe, or marginal. It aims to avoid language that is critical of occasional practitioners, dismissing this way of relating to religion as nominal or soft. This theory aspires to honor occasional religious practice as a legitimate and substantial way of being religious. It aims to acknowledge and engage occasional religious practice as a phenomenon in itself on its own terms. It aims to value who is part of the assembly in their diversity. And in this way, occasional religious practice invites dialogue. Echoing long-standing patterns of interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, those who relate to religious practices in different ways can learn from one another, while remaining firmly anchored in their own form of practice. In addition, we can come to better understand our own practice through encounter with those who relate to religion differently. In a setting like this, where we study theology and where monastic communities embody intensive practice, I would like to emphasize especially the potential for routine and intensive practitioners, including clergy and academic theologians and preachers, such as myself, to learn through encounter and dialogue with occasional practitioners. And this is not simply a sociological question. It is also a theological one. Church leaders have been wrestling with occasional religious practice for centuries. I call to mind that on the festival days, the multitudes assembled resemble the broad expanse of the sea. Where are they now who oppress us with their presence on feast days? Along comes the day of Christ's Passion, along comes Easter, and this space won't be able to contain your crowds. Will you, who have just now been filling the theaters, be the people filling this place? There are many ways that John Chrysostom and Augustine of Hippo can inspire our preaching. The way they complain about occasional religious practice in their sermons is not one of them. I strongly advise against insulting, reprimanding, or even joking about occasional practitioners when preaching. However, the fact that these ancient preachers did is one source of historical evidence for widespread occasional religious practice in early Christianity, East and West. Last year, shortly before his early death, Nathan Chase, a graduate of the School of Theology, and I co-authored an article about occasional religious practice in early Christianity. In it, we argue that occasional practice was pervasive in the 4th and 5th centuries, a period often looked to for inspiration for contemporary liturgical renewal. Quote, "If this period is still seen to represent a model for contemporary liturgical reform, liturgical scholars must reconceive normative theological understandings of who is part of the liturgical assembly. Both contemporary ethnographic research and historical evidence challenge the common liturgical theological assumption that participants are formally affiliated, fully believing, routinely practicing, morally compliant, and emotionally engaged with the tradition in which they participate liturgically. Increasing awareness of the presence of occasional practitioners in the past as well as the present should prompt liturgists to rethink whom we envision as part of the assembly." The assembly has always included occasional practitioners and will likely continue to do so. However, occasional practitioners are rarely taken seriously in the church and the theological academy. When noticed, they may be the butt of jokes. These kinds of jokes contain a grain of truth, but also reflect the hostile and dismissive attitudes of some routine practitioners and church leaders. Occasional practitioners are often viewed as irrelevant, disparaged as lesser Christians, or fetishized as a target for evangelistic efforts. The liturgical experience and theological expressions of occasional practitioners have rarely been valued as providing important perspectives on Christian faith, life, and liturgy. But this can change. Dialogue with occasional religious practitioners is possible and necessary for understanding Christian worship and doing liturgical theology and proclaiming the word of God in the liturgy today. In many cases, a crucial starting point for this dialogue is shifting attitudes toward occasional religious practice. One starting point for doing so is the ministry of Jesus. Tomáš Halík is a Czech Roman Catholic priest and theologian who served as an advisor to the Pontifical Council for Dialogue with Non-Believers and is a winner of the Templeton Prize. One of his English books is a popular volume titled Patience with God, The Story of Zacchaeus Continuing in Us. In it, Halík invites us into the story of Zacchaeus as it is found in the Gospel according to Luke. Zacchaeus is a wealthy tax collector in the city of Jericho. When Jesus passes through the city, crowds gather around him. Zacchaeus climbs a tree to get a look at Jesus. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, calls him by name, and invites himself over to his house. Halík uses the story of Zacchaeus to consider Jesus' attention to those who Halík refers to as on the fringes of faith, those who are curious seekers, but at the same time want to maintain a certain distance. Halík describes how to follow Jesus is to have a prior interest in people on the fringes of faith, a prior interest in those who remain in the anteroom of the church, those who are in the gray zone between religious certainty and atheism, those who are doubters and seekers. However, this prior interest is not a missionary interest, a desire to convert or to bring more certainty. Halík wants to honor the way Zacchaeus relate to religion, rather than trying to change it. He feels concern for them and wants to ensure that they are not manipulated. We have to learn to create space for the Zacchaeuses including those who will never become standard parishioners, or at least respect the space they create around themselves. Halik then goes a step further and suggests dialogue with those on the fringes of faith is an opportunity for mutual learning. Our closeness with seekers also ought to teach us openness. We don't have to solely think about having to teach and edify them. We can also learn a great deal from them. And we can try to show those people in the church who are self-assured and satiated about their religion that it is necessary, at least sometimes, to reach out to people on the fringe of the church, and not just to convert and assimilate them. Being able to take a look at how God appears from the standpoint of people who are searching, doubting, and questioning. Isn't this a new, exciting, necessary, and useful religious experience? Halik's reading of the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus can anchor dialogue with occasional practitioners, particularly through his openness to learning from those who are not standard parishioners. My approach to occasional practice develops Halik's theology in two new directions. First, Halik's account is quite narrowly centered on matters of belief, particularly atheism and the question of God. I am more interested in religion as practice, and how practice itself can be a starting point for dialogue and even a form of dialogue. Second, attention to occasional religious practice reveals that not all occasional practitioners are seekers. Some identify as committed Christians, others are firmly non-religious. Most who I speak with are very content with their current relationship with religion. They are not seeking something different. However, a significant contribution of Halik's account is the way he draws on liberation theologies to name Jesus' attention to forms of marginalization that are not economic. Zacchaeus was wealthy and powerful, yet on the fringes of society and the fringes of faith. I too draw inspiration from liberation theologies to emphasize attending to voices on the theological and liturgical margins. Occasional practitioners are a marginalized group in the church, and this must be taken seriously by followers of Jesus concerned with those on the margins, whether those margins are economic, social, theological, or liturgical. At the same time, there is an important distinction from economically focused liberation theologies. Economic liberation has the goal of ending poverty, of changing the identity, status, and material conditions of the poor, as well as the systems that create these conditions. Liberation on the liturgical and theological margins does not aim to change the identity, status, or way people relate to religion, or the systems that created these realities. It is more akin to liberation theologies that focus on changing how differences are perceived, such as those associated with gender, race, or ability, and with changing the systems that make these differences problematic. In other words, the goal is not to transform occasional religious practitioners into routine practitioners. Instead, the goal is to change attitudes so the liturgical and theological margins are seen as privileged places of liturgical theological insight, and a dialogue can emerge among all liturgical participants, a dialogue that may include the preacher. In this final portion of this lecture, I offer a few practical suggestions for responding pastorally to occasional religious practice, especially in preaching. But first, I need to acknowledge that leeway to change practices varies greatly across Christian traditions. Mennonite leaders have a level of flexibility that is unimaginable to Roman Catholics, for example. However, everyone has the potential to change attitudes toward occasional practitioners. And the attitudes of ministers, including preachers, are especially important because these individuals hold the most power. They have the power to determine what role Christian ritual will play in some of the most important moments of people's lives. In many cases, changing attitudes toward occasional practice can be a starting point for dialogue, and for more positive experiences of practicing religion together across difference when occasions to do so arise. I encourage routine and intensive practitioners to aspire to adopt 3 postures toward occasional practice, each which has implications for preaching: curiosity, compassion, and connection. First, adopt a posture of curiosity. Set aside assumptions about the religious identities and motivations of occasional practitioners. As I've vividly described, occasional practitioners are diverse in their religious and non-religious identities and their motivations for participation in religious practice. Yet in interviews with me, ministers have presumed that occasional practitioners are all, quote, doing it for grandma, culturally Christian, privately faithful, or spiritual but not religious. Occasional practitioners may be all or none of these things, among many other possibilities. It is also important to keep in mind that participants connected to the same event may have very different relationships with religion. For example, there may be very big differences between partners baptizing a child, or between grandparents and grandchildren attending a funeral. Setting aside assumptions about religious identity and motivation encourages us to encounter each participant as they are and to receive their story on their own terms. Their stories, honestly told, can then become part of the sermon, either directly or indirectly. This posture of curiosity is embodied in the framework that Beverly Zink Sawyer and Donner Giver Johnston introduce in their book on preaching on special occasions, For Every Matter Under Heaven. They use the same 3 questions to guide preaching on occasions that include holidays, life transitions, and times of crisis. What is going on? Who is listening? Where is God? I trust that your theological education has or is providing you with ways to address this 3rd question: where is God? I hope that this framing of occasional religious practice may provide new insight into the first 2 questions: what is going on? And especially, who is listening? In other words, who is the assembly? At the same time, your context is likely very different from the context where I did this research. My goal is not to replace one set of assumptions with another, but to encourage us all to set aside assumptions about occasional practitioners and receive the story of each person we meet. One of the exciting dimensions of the Abscolta Preaching Initiative is the emphasis on preaching as a communal process. I would be surprised if occasional practitioners join a Lectio Divina group. This seems more like the kind of thing that routine or intensive practitioners would do. But at the same time, those participants likely have insight into the experience of their partners or children or friends who are occasional practitioners. This could be one window into better understanding occasional practitioners in your context. Sacramental preparation is another opportunity for listening and for better understanding who is part of the assembly in your community. For example, David Scotchy offers some helpful practices for incorporating listening into marriage preparation and wedding rehearsals in rites of passage. Although in contrast to his focus on evangelization, I would frame this as an opportunity for dialogue. Second, adopt a posture of compassion. Anticipate crisis in the context of occasional religious practice. For many participants, occasional practices, including baptisms and funerals, are associated with crises, whether large or small, public or private. We tend to be aware of this element of crisis in relation to funerals, and as a result, lean toward compassionate responses that accommodate pastoral needs and preaching that tends toward complex emotions. We seem less aware of these aspects of crisis associated with baptism and marriage, although these are also life-altering events. Over breakfast in a quiet cafe, Greta describes looking for a church where she and her husband could celebrate their legal marriage with a Christian ceremony while expecting their first child. She is an invisibly routine, occasional practitioner, and it is very important for her to get married in a church before her child was born. Greta has a Catholic and Greek Orthodox heritage and describes being turned away by both traditions. She was heartbroken. This pregnancy followed 4 miscarriages. This context of crisis would have been largely invisible to ministers who could easily dismiss Greta as a bride looking for a wedding venue. But then she encountered an Anglican priest who was open to a conversation and was able to recognize a young couple in crisis. I spoke to the priest about the 4 that we had lost, and it was almost like she was on that journey with us. And she was so empathic and so kind, and she gave us a prayer blanket, which was completely unexpected, so incredibly appreciated. She has certain members of the congregation who make these blankets, and whenever she feels that someone is in need of a little extra prayer, she gives them to them. And that's our first baby blanket. This priest met Greta as a pastor and as a representative of the church community. Greta celebrated her marriage in that congregation, and her 2 children were baptized there. She still attends occasionally. Consider how hearing Greta's story might have impacted how this priest preached at the wedding, and even at the baptisms of Greta's children. Consider how often stories like Greta's are not known to us as preachers, yet how often they are present in the assemblies of occasional practitioners. Even holidays may be occasions when emotions are close to the surface, especially in connection with family and grief. And of course, there are also mass traumatic events that demand a response from the pulpit. There are various resources that address preaching in the context of crisis and trauma. Kimberly Wagner's Fractured Ground focuses on mass trauma, like mass shootings, natural disasters, and the pandemic. Joni Sankin's Words That Heal explores how to provide a theological response in preaching to more personal trauma. Sarah Travis's Unspeakable equips preachers with tools to avoid re-traumatizing listeners. In each case, the first step is anticipating crisis, even if it is less visible on the surface. Instead of seeing occasional practitioners as a distraction from ministry, occasional practice can be approached as an opportunity to connect with individuals and families in crisis and to meet them with compassion. And third, a posture of connection. Find common ground. To do so, approach encounters with occasional practitioners as opportunities for dialogue, opportunities for learning as much as teaching. These occasions are opportunities to hear from often marginalized voices on the prophetic edge of the church, whose experiences may shed new light on familiar practices. I have learned so much about Christian worship in conversation with occasional practitioners. 3 themes are deep currents that run through these conversations. Christian worship as material more than linguistic, emotional more than conceptual, and relational more than personal. These 3 themes are interconnected. As the stories I have shared today suggest, the material, emotional, and relational are bound up with one another in the liturgical experience of occasional practitioners. The insights that occasional practitioners provide regarding the material, emotional, and relational dimensions of worship push back on common tendencies among routine practitioners and clergy, especially liturgical theologians, to examine worship primarily as linguistic, conceptual, and individual. It is understandable that preaching can have a tendency to focus on the linguistic, the conceptual, and individual, but it doesn't have to. Occasional religious practice is an opportunity to expand this vision. I will share one concrete example, and I share this example not to suggest that you replicate it, but because it embodies these themes. I witnessed this sermon, and I heard numerous occasional practitioners speak positively about it weeks or months afterwards. It is All Saints' Day, and several baptisms are taking place during the Sunday liturgy. There are usually children in worship in this congregation, and there are additional children today, likely the siblings and family members of those being baptized. The preacher begins the homily by engaging the children, who are working on coloring pages with images of saints on a table on one side of the worship space. She holds up several of their coloring pages of examples as she tells the stories of saints, St. Francis and St. Catherine. The preacher then walks around the congregation and talks about specific members of the community as saints. She does this with humor, acknowledging that we are all imperfect, but also makes the point that at baptism, all Christians are called to be saints, to live the Beatitudes we heard about in the reading from the Gospel of Luke. The preacher next takes one of the infants who is going to be baptized into her arms and talks with the congregation about how the child's parents will share the love of God with him. "What do you want children to know about God and Jesus?" she asks. Members of the community respond aloud, calling out examples. The priest affirms and expands on their responses. The priest names how it can be challenging to talk about faith, but we can share the good news with one another of what God is doing in our lives today. We proclaim good news, not history, she says. Faith is passed across generations, the priest emphasizes. Faith is something we celebrate across generations. She then identifies the youngest person in the room, who is one of the children being baptized, and invites a parent to hold the child and go and stand on one side of the nave. From there, she begins lining people up across the front of the chancel, from youngest to oldest. She both invites volunteers by decade and calls on people by name until she reaches those in their 80s or 90s. About 15 people are lined up across the front of the church. She references the Heritage Church building, explaining how this line extends even further back. Gesturing toward the long line of people, the priest concludes, "This is the body of Christ. This is who we are. This is who the baptized are joining. We proclaim the living Christ." Those gathered at the front return to their seats, and the service continues with the baptisms. This sermon embodies these three themes. It connects materially with the children's artwork, the Heritage building, and most of all with the people gathered. It connects emotionally with joy and laughter, but also naming serious challenges and deep hopes. It connects relationally, emphasizing faith passed on in families, but also relationships within the church community, alive and present, and extending through time, including the saints. The sermon is strikingly concrete, interactive, and intergenerational. At the same time, it is rooted in core Christian commitments, the celebration of baptism, an occasion in the Christian year, and central convictions about God and Jesus. Many occasional practitioners considered this sermon a highlight of the baptism service. It is an example of finding common ground. It might be a bit of an extreme example. You might not be able to do this in your community or pull this off as a preacher. But I hope it gives you a sense of what finding common ground might look like in preaching, in connection with the material, emotional, and relational aspects of the liturgy. These three postures, curiosity, compassion, and connection, can shape preaching and ministry more broadly with occasional practitioners. And preaching matters to occasional practitioners. It is sometimes a compelling preacher that draws occasional practitioners to a particular congregation on certain occasions. A sermon may stand out as a high point from the event. Most surprising to me, occasional practitioners may remember details of a sermon weeks or even months later, much more readily than I do. Ministry preaching also matters to ministers. In interviews, preachers often wonder about and reflect on how to preach at times when they anticipate that many occasional practitioners will be present. The practice of preaching, as a practice of common concern, is an opportunity for dialogue through practice. These three postures, curiosity, compassion, and connection, are postures that invite dialogue. And dialogue begins with listening. To return to fulfilled in your hearing. In order to make connections between the lives of the people and the gospel, the preacher will have to be a listener before being a speaker. Listening is not an isolated moment. It is a way of life. It means openness to God's voice, not only in the scriptures, but in the events of our daily lives and in the experience of our brothers and sisters, including our siblings who are occasional practitioners. We listen together as a community. We listen to the scriptures, we listen to the people, and we ask, what are they saying to one another? What are they asking of one another? And out of that dialogue between the Word of God and the Scriptures, and the Word of God in the lives of God's people, the Word of God and preaching begins to take shape. On the occasions when they are present, and there are many such occasions, this dialogue includes occasional religious practitioners. May we listen well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for such an insightful presentation, helping us to pay closer attention to the reality of religious practice in our own social context. We have a few minutes for questions. I can go around and pass around the microphone if anybody has questions.
Questions, reflections, points of connection or disconnection from your own experience or context. I'd love to hear more about what this looks like in this setting.
Remember, this is her next book, so the more feedback you can give her, the better.
I hope it's not just professors who ask. First, thank you so much. Really appreciate the depth and detail in which you lay out a sort of cartography of what assemblies that are full actually look like. I'm curious, as you went through the process of speaking with occasional religious practitioners, first you had to find them. Having done a bit of ethnography myself in churches, it's easiest to find those who are already there. Could you talk to us a little bit about the research process in finding and reaching folks who maybe aren't there all the time?
Yes, that's a great question, especially when doing research that's grounded in interviews. You need to both find people who will talk to you and then have good, rich, deep, honest conversations with them. And I am very fortunate to have had many of those conversations as part of this research, and I really see the starting point for that kind of research is finding the common point of connection, finding the common ground. So I connected with people who had participated in baptisms or funerals in 3 specific partner congregations. And I'm very grateful to clergy in those congregations who introduced me to everyone at their pastoral discretion who had had a baptism or a funeral in that community in a certain time period. And occasional practitioners are invested in those practices, right? And are very willing to talk about a baptism or willing to talk about a funeral. And then that became a starting point for much wider ranging conversations about experiences of religion and liturgy and religious practice. So that was really an entry point to a larger conversation. But because they were excited and willing to talk about that particular practice, it created a starting point for good conversation. I also think it was very important for the research that I am not an Anglican priest, and I was not someone from whom they were seeking a practice that they desired. I was speaking with them after the practice had taken place in a confidential context. And I think, therefore, I was able to hear things that they might not have shared in the context of seeking a practice, especially a practice they were really hoping for, where sometimes they might feel expectations to say certain things or present themselves in particular ways. I think that's one of the things that can be really challenging and harmful in those pastoral interactions, is the lack of honesty and transparency. And having this ethnographic research context, having an interview with someone who's not Anglican, who's not in leadership in a congregation that they're connected to, created a really generative space for really rich conversation.
I presume you're recording, so you need our voices. Maybe not. Okay. Sarah, thank you for everything. I found myself wondering similar thing. How do you find the people that aren't there, right? And then I found myself wondering if those type of people, so I was glad to hear that they were eager to talk to you and were invested in the way that you started working with them. But did you, through your course of your research, did you run into people who were ashamed of not being there more often?
That was not the dominant experience. So and it's a good question. But for the most part, the people who I spoke with were very content with their relationship with religion, were not looking for something different. In fact, saw it as very ordinary, that they would participate for life transitions, if that's the sort of subset of practices that they're participating in, and would practice a few times a year, and did not see that as problematic or something that they would desire to be different. There was one exception to that, who was one participant who did, I would say, experience some guilt about practicing occasionally rather than routinely. And she is someone who'd experienced some religious trauma that she was carrying that was part of why she was not practicing routinely. So it's hard to hear those stories when religious practice can be a context of harm, and there's that sort of self-imposed, in this case, expectation to practice more regularly. But that was not the dominant pattern. Many people were very comfortably identifying as sort of a phrase that was used was sort of not very religious, or seeing this as very, very ordinary. Or there's one quote, a participant says, "Oh, my father used to say, really good Anglicans, they go Christmas and Easter." Right? Like redefining what good religious practice looks like.
My mother used to speak about the Hardy annuals, who were there a couple times a year. And just, I think my shame question is coming more from a Catholic guilt kind of thing. So I'm not trying to wonder about something that's not there. It's just, But part of the reason I found myself thinking about this, not for the shame reason, but my own mother went through all kinds of ins and outs of being a regular churchgoer as I was growing up, and I never got the chance to have that conversation with her as I turned into a ministering adult, but because she died early in my, right after I graduated from college. But I think part of her story was she was very religious and very pious and very regular about attending church before the Vatican Council. And then things changed, and for some reason she was not into that, and so she would disappear from church life for a long time, and Dad was taking us to church, and then she came back around, and then something happened and she disappeared again. And I never got a chance to have that conversation with her. What was that about, And now, of course, the aunts and uncles have passed away, so I'll never know that question. That'll be the first conversation we have when we meet up in heaven again. But anyway, just a backstory.
No, thank you for sharing that story. I think it points to how being an occasional practitioner is really a situational role, not a stable identity. And it changes over the course of life for many people. And as you described, maybe it's external factors like the Second Vatican Council, but it might also be things that change, like moving to a new city. Or many people become occasional practitioners as they age, and it becomes more difficult to access their religious communities. Like there are some kind of expected life course patterns that are associated with occasional practice too.
Thank you, Sarah. I've been thinking about how, teachers come from weird students, and religious professionals tend to come from weird Christians, right, who practice more. And so I'm wondering, since you do formation, you're involved in formation work, how you think about how you might sort of do formation work around these questions to build the kind of compassion and other things that you're calling for.
Like, in some sense, how do we learn to minister in ways that honor occasional practitioners? I think that's part of what we're trying to do here tonight. Part of this is trying to hear the stories of occasional practitioners and share their stories and encourage us to listen to the stories that are all around us. This may be the largest religious group in the United States and Canada. How do we start paying attention and start listening to these very, very ordinary but often ignored experiences? So I think part of it is sort of becoming aware of that very pervasive reality, and then starting to pay attention, starting to listen, starting to honor this way of being religious instead of feeling like it is a problem to be solved or a failure on the part of religious leaders. I think that's actually a place where some of the shame and guilt resides, is the sense that, oh no, did we as religious leaders do something wrong that's causing this occasional religious practice? How do we let go of those kinds of attitudes and instead see this as an ordinary way of being religious, and a way of being religious that we can be in conversation with, rather than trying to sort of minimize or change?
If I can just ask one more question. I wondered about the young people. I don't know if you had a chance to talk to a lot of young people during your research. We often think that their agency is limited in terms of whether they can go to church or want to go to church or not go to church or choose not to go to church, especially if they're underage and they're not driving, maybe, perhaps. In their religious practice, did their agency matter? Do they choose not to go because of intention? Or is it largely dependent on the adults because they don't have the same kind of agency, perhaps, as the adults?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Demographic factors are certainly very present in occasional religious practice, and for this study, everyone is over the age of 18. That's part of the selection criteria for interviews. Interviewing minors is more complex. So everyone who I interviewed for this project was an adult, but reflect a pretty broad range of ages within that spectrum. Especially interviewing parents who are baptizing children. Many of them would have been in their kind of late 20s or 30s. So it partly depends on how you define young people. But one of the patterns that shows up really strongly in the quantitative data on religious change across the global north is with each generation, the next generation is less religious than the previous generation in terms of measures of affiliation and belief and practice. So if we look at those trend lines, we see, the oldest generation is more religious than the next generation, than the next generation. And when we see that shift, that intergenerational religious transmission, and that's a huge social trend that's really shaping the religious landscape across the United States and Canada and Europe. And that shows up in this research too. People will name those patterns in their own families. They'll say, my grandparents were more religious, and then my parents were a bit less religious, and then I'm so maybe a little bit less, at least I'm sort of more occasional, but like they describe these patterns for themselves. So I do think that kind of shift does happen. But in terms of questions of agency, I sometimes wonder if it's helpful to ask the question the other way around. Like, why would we see it as an ordinary thing to go to church regularly, to participate in religious practices routinely? Why is it routine practitioners who don't need to explain themselves, and it's occasional practitioners who get asked that question, especially if that's the more pervasive pattern? So I think that's part of that. How do we recognize this is a very ordinary way of being religious? How do we value it? How do we not ask why, but instead ask for the story of this baptism, of this funeral, of this wedding, of why this occasion is significant for those who are choosing to participate in it right now.
Thank you, Sarah. I especially appreciated the call to change attitudes. But following up, my question was, the historical context, was there a point in time when everybody was an occasional practitioner? Was there a point when it became standard practice and the expectation that religious populations be regular practitioners?
Oh, so this is something that Nathan and I suggest might be worth investigating in that article, is that we're curious. We revisited the evidence from the 4th and 5th century asking this question: how was occasional religious practice present? What would happen if we revisited the historical record from other periods with that question in mind? What might we learn about the pervasive presence of occasional religious practice across a wide range of different historical contexts? I have a few kind of short vignettes in the book that look at some different historical periods. So I think it's an important question to consider. One factor of that, too, is these larger religious landscape trends. And it can be helpful to keep in mind an argument that some sociologists have made, which is that the mid-20th century is really like a peak rather than a norm. And because that kind of 1960s is still a living memory for many people, it was a formative time for many leaders, that tends to be set as a baseline. Whereas if we see that mid-century peak in North America not as the baseline, but as sort of an exceptionally religious time in terms of active participation and affiliation. I think that's also part of that historical narrative, is kind of setting our own moment in a much broader trajectory, not just the last 75 years.
If we could give another round of applause for Dr. Sarah Kathleen Johnson.